Greetings, system failure listeners. Nate here with your weekly essay read. This one entitled Water into Wine and subtitled Resurrected Wine Gods Haunted Rome. The major theme of this essay is ego death, an experience induced pharmacologically in ancient times that heavily influenced both Greek philosophy and the rise of Christianity. Key takeaways. Number 1. The cult of Dionysus was a predecessor to Christianity in which initiates drank wine spiked with psychoactive ingredients. Number 2. The Roman government cracked down on the cult of Dionysus in 186 BC because it threatened the political establishment. Number 3. 200 years later, Christianity borrowed many symbols from the cult of Dionysus in its revolt against the cruel economic hierarchy of the Roman Empire. Psychedelic wine. During the 1st century AD, Dioscorides was a Greek physician serving in the Roman army. He wrote De Materia Medica, a comprehensive 5-volume pharmacopoeia listing the healing properties of every substance then known to medicine. His landmark work was considered definitive all the way up until the time of the Renaissance. Dioscorides' entire 5th volume was dedicated to wine mixed with psychoactive ingredients such as the hallucinogenic and highly toxic mandrake root. He carefully recommended doses that induced visionary experiences without poisoning the drinker. The fact that some 20% of his pharmacopoeia was dedicated exclusively to such concoctions shows how the ancient Greeks and Romans used wine as a delivery system for other substances. The story of Alexander's best friend, Hephaestion, drives the point home. In observance of the Greek tradition, games were held in his honor after he died. One of those was a drinking contest at which 41 additional people died, according to the Greek historian Diodorus. Clearly, those Greeks were drinking more than mere Cabernet Sauvignon from their goblets. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a priestess of the wine god Dionysus. In the Vatican Museum, there are so many mosaics and statues of Dionysus that, on a recent visit, our tour guide felt compelled to explain that Christianity sourced many of its familiar traditions from pre-Christian predecessors. Our tour guide was referring to the story of Dionysus' resurrection. He was a late addition to the Greek pantheon. The worship of Dionysus started much later than the mysteries of Eleusis, which anchored the religions of Greece and Rome for thousands of years. Dionysus' mythology eventually merged with that of Eleusis, and he became the son of Zeus and Persephone. There were several variations to the Dionysus myth. He was accidentally killed by his father or torn apart by monsters. Zeus then brought his dead child back to life, either by carrying the corpse within his own body or by having a mortal girl hold him in her womb until Dionysus was reborn. Dionysus was either the only son physically begotten by Zeus, or he was born of a virgin. Both legends later merged into the familiar story of Jesus. The Roman crackdown. Just as at Eleusis, the Dionysian proceedings were dominated by women. While the drugs consumed at Eleusis were called kykeon after the Homeric epics, the psychoactive wine consumed during the Dionysia celebrations was called pharmakon. Depending on the context, pharmakon could mean poison, remedy, or scapegoat, i.e., the taking on of someone else's sins, a major Christian theme. Instead of Dionysus, the Romans referred to the wine god as Bacchus. In 186 BC, the Roman government violently suppressed the popular Bacchic cult. The Roman historian Livy left us with a chilling account of its high priestess, Pacula Anea, and the execution of some 6,000 cultists. According to Livy, the cult functioned as a state within a state. Upstart religions are often persecuted by existing authorities whose power and influence are threatened when citizens organize themselves outside of established political systems. That's what Livy meant by the Bacchic cult being a state within a state. Furthermore, the experience of ego death amplified the political threat posed by religions centered around psychoactive drugs. The ego is the mental conception of the self. It's how one knows which mouth to feed at the dinner table. Ego death is a temporary dissolution of that mental artifact. The experience of ego death feels like a death and rebirth of the self. That's how resurrected gods became symbols for ego-dissolving drugs. The ego is the only handle by which the authorities can grab us. When people stop identifying as their physical bodies, they can no longer be threatened with prison, torture, or execution. Jesus was so confident that he was not his physical body that he consented to a gruesome public execution. The remarkable story of Christ, whether true in the literal sense or not, advertised the limitations of state power as Rome headed into her twilight. The Gospel of John. The Roman authorities co-opted the cult of Dionysus after 186 BC and removed the psychedelic element that so threatened them. 2 centuries later, Christianity arose as another rebellion against the Roman establishment. Many of its symbols were borrowed directly from the older underground tradition of Dionysus. Where wild grapes are native to Greece, organized viticulture and wine grapes were transplanted there by Semitic Phoenician traders. That's why the wine god Dionysus was portrayed as a foreigner who arrived from the east. Because the story of Christ was about a resurrected Jew from Palestine who turned water into wine, it was familiar to millions of Greeks living within the Roman Empire. They would have instantly recognized the reference to the ego-dissolving drugs of Dionysus. During the Dionysian festival known as Thea, priests would place 3 empty bronze basins inside a building. The doors of the building were then sealed with witnesses present. The following morning, the seals would be broken, and the basins would be found filled with wine. The trick of turning water into wine would later be attributed to Jesus, who accomplished an identical feat according to the Gospel of John. The New Testament is a Greek story, originally written in Greek, but set in Palestine. In addition to borrowing the transformation of water into wine, John also used the language of Greek philosophy to portray Jesus as an embodiment of the Logos, a term used by the Greeks to signify reason, divine order, and the principle that governs the universe. Logos is the Greek word for word, and it shows up in the first line of John. In the beginning was the word. The ego-dissolving kykion of Eleusis and the pharmakon of Dionysus influenced the Greek inventions of democracy and drama, which both deprioritize the sense of self. Democracy means making decisions collectively rather than individually, while actors discard their identities and adopt whole new personas on stage. It's no coincidence that these innovations come to us from people who ritualistically dissolved their egos. But the New Testament remains the most significant Greek contribution to modern civilization, and much of its symbology reflects the worship of the wine god Dionysus that came before it. Conclusion. The bread of Eleusis and the wine of Dionysus went on to become the Christian Eucharist, still observed all over the world in modern times. But after Roman authorities co-opted the Christian faith and made it the state religion of their dying empire, they abandoned psychedelic ingredients and used regular bread and wine as enduring symbols of Christianity's major theme of death and resurrection. The experience of ego death feels precisely like a personal death and rebirth. That's why the mystery religions of the ancient Mediterranean basin used psychedelic compounds to induce it. The experience of ego death and rebirth found a perfect allegory in ancient stories of resurrected gods, and Christianity borrowed heavily from those traditions. Alrighty, folks, well, that is it for this week's audio essay. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider paying us a little visit over at systemfailure.org. There you can see the text versions of these essays complete with further materials, quotes, and paintings and pictures to illustrate their points. Furthermore, if you'd like to get in contact with either Brian or myself, you can accomplish that feat over on the About page at systemfailure.org, simply by clicking on the appropriate name. Alrighty, folks, well, I will be back on Monday with Brian with another regularly scheduled edition of the System Failure Podcast. Can't wait to talk to you all then. In the meantime, I hope you're having a great week.